I was an assistant to a mad scientist who switched his body. I'll be brief and to the point. This information has to be shared, so that others may also know the truth. I worked for the famous scientist Dr. Stoia, back in a small village in our home country. A place where he's known as a hero. The man that could cure any ailment or disease. He enjoyed hiding behind a facade of kindness to keep up appearances, helpful and courteous when he encountered those in the street. But behind the fake smile and kind gestures was a cruel man, who robbed others of their lives, so that he could extend his own. He had recently turned 94 years old when I met him in the summer of '72, after having just completed my studies. I couldn't believe it at first, but he had the appearance of a man half his age. Eventually, I would learn that his lifelong research provided him with deep insight on the human body. Ways to overcome disease and degeneration of the tissue, information that he jealously guarded for himself. His eyes focused intently on me as he went on about his need for an assistant that could match his tenacity. I assured him I could, as I too was a man of great drive and determination. My formal training and experience helped cement my position. Soon we had begun a new partnership, and I was ready to learn everything he had to teach. I wanted to do something good. For my family. For myself. For the world. But sometimes, lines can become blurry. As assistant, I would come to understand that Dr. Stoia's demands were considerable. There was never room for failure, of which I also agreed. I am a perfectionist after all. Over time, I learned the things he had to teach me. Aside from his own personal notes that he kept hidden away. I then began conducting my own experiments, and as the years passed, together we made breakthrough after breakthrough. Tireless nights spent unraveling mysteries and producing answers. Decades of research. But eventually, Dr. Stoia began showing signs of physically slowing down. The pains were growing and several rounds of testing proved what he had feared. That was when we increased his injections and the frequency of his ice baths to twice a day, among other methods to shock the body into regenerating. It helped for a few months, giving us a sense of hope, but then found he could no longer delay the inevitable. At 122 years old, even with his injections and methods, his body had become frail and was failing. His only consolation was that his mind was as sharp as ever. Stoia grew quiet and distant for a while, no doubt thinking about his mortality. Even with his knowledge and equipment, there's only so much that could be done. A few days passed in solitude, until he came to us with our next task. He demanded the assistance of his closest team to perform a secret operation. To transplant his brain into a healthy body. He had attempted this very same procedure several times with smaller organisms, but their physiology was too delicate. On larger animals, however, studies demonstrated great success. Stoia would spend months raising these creatures, getting to know their personalities, their temperament, and when the procedures were successful, he continued to test them, to find that same link. The results were astonishing. With his time pressed and his days numbered, the doctor had everything he needed, except for one last thing. No one would ever be willing to donate their body, especially as the donor had to be conscious throughout the process. Kept alive right at the brink of death. For a moment, I was afraid that it would be me, forced under the knife. But Dr. Stoia said I was too important. I was grateful for the boon in spirit, but it was disturbing to think someone else would be taken unwillingly. So they procured a specimen that fit the doctor's description and brought him in during the night. The man woke up from his drug-induced sleep, screaming while his body was prepped. Machines whirred and buzzed as they performed countless tests to ensure that he was a prime candidate. When I first arrived to work with Dr. Stoia, I wanted to help as many as I could. To research further into the human body and mind. To heal and help others. But forcing people against their will, it was an abomination. But the mad doctor assured me the man was a violent criminal that had been locked up. That no one would miss him, and being part of the experiment would be the highest honor he could ever receive. After a time of wrestling with my conscience, I conceded, and we continued with the plan, although the entire ordeal left me feeling uneasy. The old scientist was thrilled, seemingly eager to undergo the operation. He had all of his research given to us beforehand, to ensure our work was flawless. Techniques, steps, injection serums. It had everything. And there were always safety measures in place so that everyone's cooperation was assured. During the procedure, both patients were opened up from the back. The donor's brain was stored for later testing, and then we carefully transferred Stoia's brain and stem into the new body. Several injections were administered along with low waves of electric current, then we knit up the vessels, nerves and muscles. After many hours of meticulous work, the final layer of skin was stitched up, and we left the old scientist to heal. At first there was no brain activity, but the machines around him continued working to give him life. Days passed when we finally began to see a response on the machines. Weeks went by and the activity increased, then one day, he woke up and blinked his eyes for the first time. His team stood around with exhausted grins on their faces, then he simply said, "Success." And we knew. He was overjoyed, a tear running down his cheek, which his new body produced from his own emotion. It was monumental. Dr. Stoia rested in bed, awake and actively thinking, using the recovery time to plan his next conquest. It took a while for him to move, afraid to destroy the careful work that had been done. But with the injections and constant care, soon he was speaking and moving his fingers. He spoke about things he saw during the operation, equating the experience to those who have claimed to see lights and spirits when crossing into the afterlife. Before long, his personality had returned, along with his energy. His appetite and desire for physical activity grew. Soon he was running and jumping, unafraid of whatever stood in his way. He had been reborn. They had a funeral for the old man, and as was expected, he was heavily honored and treated to a celebration fit for a king. We all kept working away as usual, because we knew nothing had really changed. It was merely the shell of the man standing before us. No stone was left unturned, and so Stoia was in possession of paperwork showing he was a nephew of the great doctor and inherited the estate with no issues from the bureaucrats. In the coming weeks, I recall the doctor mentioning involuntary movements with his new body. Small events that eventually progressed. He would catch himself walking and moving around in his sleep without realizing he was doing so. On more than one occasion, he found himself close to being injured. Sleepwalking was the initial diagnosis, but it started happening while he was awake as well. He had to fight and concentrate in order to keep control. For a while, he managed the routine well enough. However, after leaving the lab one night, we stood at a busy intersection, waiting to cross. Things with Dr. Stoia had been going well, and it seemed his episodes were clearing up, when suddenly he began walking into oncoming traffic. I saw the struggle on his face as he tried with all his strength to fight it. But he couldn't. My hands gripped his jacket tight, but he gave me a hard shove back, pushing me to the ground. Cars swerved and missed him by inches, then finally he was struck and collapsed. When he woke some time later, he was back at his laboratory surrounded by myself and the team. I explained the situation, but no one could produce a reason for the event. Dr. Stoia's days continued much in the same fashion, losing control more often than not. I could see him slowly losing his sanity. He spent more and more time in the lab, until he decided that he would never leave his lab again. Being restrained was the only way in order to minimize any unforeseen accidents. Only then could he focus enough to continue his journey for a solution. However, during an experiment one day, He seemed to have a eureka moment. I was working opposite him when he suddenly looked to me with a strange expression. "I need a willing host," he said calmly. He looked me in the eyes and smiled. "It's you." "But you need me," I replied with a shaky voice. "My notes should be plenty. After all, anything is better than this." He gestured to himself with a partially freed hand, body restrained by several straps. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to go through with it, of course, but if I didn't, my family would not be safe. While I entertained the idea of having my brain scooped out, Dr. Stoia started twitching and spasming more than ever. Then he lost control. His hand contorted and slipped out of the restraints, quickly grabbing one of the many vials within arm's reach. I watched the moment unfold, not saying a word. He slowly raised the liquid and held it there for several seconds before pouring the entire contents on top of his head. The doctor did not make a sound, but the look on his face told me he was screaming inside as the acid burned his scalp down to the bone. When I thought it couldn't get any worse, he calmly freed himself from his restraints with one hand and walked over to the other side of the room, merely a passenger in his own body. He stopped in front of a large coal furnace and turned the rusted handle, the hinges squealing loudly as the iron cover was pulled open. Then without hesitation, Dr. Stoia stepped into the furnace and closed the door behind him. He burned alive in silence with eyes fixed on me. It was a lot to take in. A lot to witness. I was horrified, but I couldn't look away. Until I watched his eyeballs melt from his skull. I suppose that was justice for stealing someone's body. It must have been rejecting the transplant on a level we had never thought possible. Fortunately, there had been no one else in the lab, as usually it was just us. So I managed to grab everything that I could find, such as jewels, gold and books. But most important, Dr. Stoia's journals. So much power within those pages. Decades spent collecting data and implementing it until something greater was achieved. I could never let it fall into the hands of someone like him. And that was the end of my time with the Mad Doctor. Our family goes by a new name now. We're in a new country, in a new small town, where we'll remain indefinitely. We're safe and living a comfortable life, which is all I ever wanted. At least the truth is here, in these pages. Now you know the secret behind Dr. Stoia's legacy and the fallacies behind his motivations. Yet I find myself turning through the pages of his notes. Although the extensive documentation of ailments, cures and poisons certainly have been helpful to us. But it's led me down a dark path, delving further into Stoia's life-extending experiments. There's great evil in these procedures and rituals. Yet I'm intrigued and fascinated beyond all reason. Sincerely, the assistant.